Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Abercrombie. There's nothing better than the perfect jean and going out top combo, or an outfit that perfectly matches your plans. Abercrombie's relaxed jean goes with every occasion. Date nights with something lace, or daytime with a cozy sweater. And their barrel jean will surprise you. It's the trend that will become a staple in your wardrobe. Abercrombie denim comes in tons of rises, fits, and washes. Find your perfect pair online or in store.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinninmont, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to find a semblance of order in this mad world.
And today we're joined by our favorite Glaswegian co-host to hear all about the Munich Security Conference, which was held the past weekend. Jane is going to tell us all about her time in Munich, take the temperature on European defense and security thinking, look ahead to the next 12 months, and share some of her interactions with absolutely top-table movers and shakers in the defense and security world. Jane, the Munich Security Conference, oh my God, I'm so jealous. I couldn't believe that you got invited. I mean, this is the most important gathering of the year on transatlantic security. It has been dubbed the Defense Davos. So you've been to previous Munich security conferences, right?
Yeah.
How was this year's event different than what happened before? Who was there? What was said?
So the Munich Security Conference is very focused on European security, but it does bring in voices from the rest of the world, and it's trying to become a bit more global in the last few years. But at the same time, Europeans who used to be looking more at issues in the Middle East, Africa, elsewhere, since 2022, they have been really focused on one thing above all, which is Ukraine. And this is a conference where the Russians used to participate every year. Serhiy Lavrov would speak, and then he would book out a room in the hotel where it's held, the Bayerischer Hof, and he would have loads of bilaterals. You know, all these ministers have meetings of like 15 minutes each with other ministers, heads of state, and he would occupy a room and loads of people would go to see him and discussions would be held. Zarif, when he was the Iranian foreign minister, he used to be there as well. That doesn't exist anymore. In 2022, the conference took place before the invasion, but the Russians didn't show up. We wonder why. And since then, they haven't been invited back. The Iranians haven't been invited back either. It's become more of a conversation of like-minded people.
Jane, so could you tell us a little bit about how the disorder in U.S.-European relations was on display?
This was absolutely the theme of the conference, really, this disorder in the transatlantic relationship. But it was prefaced by the fact that Pete Hegseth had been at NATO the previous week, and he had basically put on the table there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine, and there will be talks with Russia in which Ukraine will have to give up a lot of its territory. And then there were sort of questions about whether he'd walked some of that back. And so at Munich, Europeans were prepared to hear from senior Trump administration officials, including Vance, Rubio, and Kellogg, about what was planned for the US and Europe to try to work together to try to bring about an end to the Ukraine war. What they got from Vance was something really quite different, and it did send shockwaves through the audience, although people have interpreted it in different ways. But basically, he didn't talk about Russia, and he did not talk at all about Ukraine. He talked about democracy and how Europeans should try it. He said things like, democracy, it isn't just about having nice buildings. And he made it clear that what he meant was that Europeans should abandon efforts to fight disinformation. This is censorship. They should listen more to those that oppose migration, because he claimed that no one had voted for millions of unvetted migrants to come in to their countries. One of those real half-truths where, yes, it's true, nobody voted for that, but countries are generally not letting in millions of unvetted migrants. He weirdly started to talk about pro-life protests in Scotland, where sometimes those have numbered in terms of, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. And basically, he came to an audience that wanted to know how they could work with the US against what they see as a growing Russian threat to Europe. And he told them that their primary security concern was not a concern, because the real threat came from within. And he then went to meet with the AfD leader while snubbing the elected German Chancellor. This was something really quite new. The Europeans who were gathered in Munich knew that the US was trying to retrench its security commitments in Europe. They were expecting that. But what they heard was something a bit darker. Now, there are different interpretations of what Vance said. Several people that I spoke to said he had probably written a speech about Ukraine and then decided to put it in the bin because he saw Trump reacting against Hegseth saying too much. And he thought, better to leave the geopolitics to the boss, and I'll just do some identity politics that's basically foreign policy for the clicks. This is going to sound great on, Truth Social and MAGA Twitter, and people are going to love me. So that was one interpretation, that it was basically a distraction and a bit of marketing. But the other interpretation that other people put forward was that, this was planned and that it was part of an effort to sort of put Europe under a warning, to say, don't take our support and alliance for granted. You need to fall into line. That, the US views on democracy are not what they once were, and that's going hand in hand with a government that back at home, is sort of defunding the National Endowment for Democracy, getting rid of all the US aid projects that funded democracy and human rights overseas, and ensuring that government websites delete mentions of everything from diversity to climate change. So really people were left reeling. And as a result, you've seen the talks really extended. As just today, as we're recording, European leaders are meeting in a different configuration in Paris to try to quickly get together their own counter-proposals for Ukraine, while the Americans are in Saudi Arabia meeting with Putin.
Now let's talk about how the Munich Security Conference is actually impactful. To what extent did the discussions that transpire at the summit actually affect the war in Ukraine? To what extent do they actually affect defense spending by countries? To what extent do they affect NATO strategy?
So really important discussions are being had at this conference about the future of Ukraine. But amid that, everyone is also trying to work out what is going to be said between the Americans and the Russians in meetings that Europeans expected, if they ever happened, they'd attend, and now realise they're not going to be able to attend. Trump's Ukraine envoy Kellogg was there. He had lots of private meetings. He also spoke on the record, but he seemed largely to be there to deliver the message to Europeans that they wouldn't be at the table because then it would be too large and too complicated and there'd be too many of them. And it was generally felt that Kellogg was somewhat sidelined now from a bigger conversation that Trump wants to have directly with Putin, with Rubio and Witkoff and others more directly involved. So Again, Zelensky was kind of the star of Munich. He called for Europe to wake up and to come together and build its own European army, something obviously Europeans have never thought they had to have in recent memory because of having NATO. I talked to Serhiy Leschenko, who is a former Ukrainian MP and who now advises President Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak. He's an anti-corruption activist, he has worked as a journalist, and he's also involved in supervising the railways in Ukraine. And he tried to set out the idea that this is a wake-up call that Europe needs. He likens it to a cold shower, and we're all being told all the time that cold showers are very good for us.
Munich is a very symbolic place. In 1938, leaders made a huge mistake by letting Hitler to get what he wanted. And in 2022, President Zelensky was in Munich to meet with Vice President Kamala Harris. No proper weapons were provided to Ukraine. And now, in 3 years' time, 2025, we should avoid next big Munich mistake. It means Ukraine is fighting not only for our cities, villages, and forests, but we are fighting for values, we're fighting for global order. Everything can be destroyed if Putin challenges the unity of European and Euro-Atlantic partners. Ukraine is a core in this situation. Stand with Ukraine means you are defending yourself from sending your troops on the front lines. And if Putin invades NATO country, even with a small so-called special military operation, it will destroy the whole system of security and demonstrate that he can dictate the will for nations in Europe. That is why in Munich we are not discussing just how to stop bloody war in Ukraine, but we are discussing how to provide Ukraine the guarantees which will not let Putin to repeat it. And these guarantees includes long-term support of Ukraine. The best way would be to include Ukraine into NATO. Munich is the place to discuss about it. We all lost illusions within last week after the statement of American officials from new administration. This is very much refreshing shower. It's a cold shower for all partners within NATO. That is why we come to Munich to call our partners, stand with Ukraine, and we will do our best together. And in case of further Putin aggression, Ukraine will defend the common values and this unity.
What's the mood like in Ukraine at the moment, given the things that the US has been saying over the past week?
If I say there is no shocks, I will not be correct. Of course, ordinary people kind of expect that the US always on the Ukrainian side, no matter what, because we have this Budapest Memorandum guarantees from 1994 when Ukraine get rid of nuclear weapons. But for establishment, for politicians, we're less surprised because we understand what's happened in US. And in the middle-term perspective, it will have even worse development in the sense that American administration will be more and more looking into their own interest inside the US and to limit their capacity to defend partners outside of US. That is why, in some sense, bad news that it happened, good news that it happened not so late. We lost these illusions just in time when we have to establish this unity around Ukraine. We don't want to stop the war by paying the price only by our side without compromise from Russia. Peace deal with Ukraine should include Ukrainian interests, should include Ukraine sitting on the table, but not only Ukraine, but also our European partners, because we consider Europe as a future union.
And a lot of the discussion around this conference is about what could Europe do for Ukraine if actually the US does not want to give us much support anymore. What would you like to ask Europeans to do that they can realistically do without such a US presence as they've been used to?
I can say there are three options. The best one, of course, would be to include Ukraine into NATO. It will just cut logic of Putin, because the logic of his war declared by Putin was to prevent Ukrainian membership in NATO. And if Ukraine is part of NATO, this war has no sense to go on. It's a nonsense to continue the war when the worst case scenario for Putin happened. Ukraine is part of NATO. But we see very limited chance for this happens within next years. The second option can be presence of our partners' troops on Ukrainian ground as the peacekeepers. President Zelensky mentioned 100,000 troops to stay on the contact line and around to guarantee ceasefire, to make this status sustainable and long-term. But there is still option number 3. If Ukraine is not NATO, if there is no partner countries' troops on Ukrainian ground, we can ask to have NATO inside Ukraine by provision weapons and sources for Ukraine to be capable to defend our land. We can produce our weapons inside Ukraine, especially drones. Drone production facilities of Ukraine, I believe, number 1 in the world now. Possible future wars gonna be a war of drones. And Ukraine is very capable to defend ourselves and to provide expertise and to provide best service for our partners.
Thank you, Serhiy. It's been a pleasure talking to you here in Munich.
Thank you for everything done by your government, your citizens for Ukraine. Ukraine is always a reliable partner.
But of course, there is also a lot of gloom among Ukrainians around the conference, not least about the discussion being had with them about rare earth minerals, including lithium, which Ukraine has rich deposits of. There's been a lot of reporting that the Trump administration wanted to do a deal to get access to Ukraine's minerals. Lindsey Graham said at the conference this was a great idea because that would give America something to defend in Ukraine. But it also emerged that what seems to have been suggested to Zelensky is that he give America rights over Ukrainian rare earths, not in return for future security guarantees, but as compensation for assistance that Ukraine has had from America in the past. So as one Ukrainian participant said to me, this is not a deal, it's not transactionalism. There's no transaction. It's just exploitation at a time when we're vulnerable. And it's just quite difficult to see how a leader could agree to that when they also have to maintain the support from their own population.
Let's talk about the German dynamics of this conference. Germany is set to go to elections next week. What was the atmosphere like there? What are people anticipating will happen? Is it going to be another surge of neopopulism with the AfD making gains? And what are the implications of this wave of Trumpian anti-immigrant neopopulism just kind of rolling on and on?
So generally, people are thinking that Germany is going to go more towards the conservative right. That is quite likely that Friedrich Merz, who was speaking at the conference, could be the new leader, although Pistorius, the defense minister, is also favored by some. But within the conference, actually, there was a closing of ranks. There was very much a sense from the Germans that they were all outraged by seeing Americans come and lecture them about how to form their coalitions and how to run their democracy. And they wanted to show this united front that there will be a commitment to stronger European defence, whatever happens. And I think that's a message you saw from the UK as well, which was quite interesting, that UK speakers were talking about things that the UK had done in the past to support Ukraine seamlessly, as though that hadn't been done by another government. So I think they're trying to send the message that European defence commitments are going to continue despite elections, but they must be also quite worried that if there's more and more support, from JD Vance or Elon Musk or whoever, for the right-wing parties that are actually more pro-Russia, like the AfD, that they could see a new kind of election interference in the future, basically.
So you were in Munich with all these bigwigs. I mean, the absolutely creme de la creme of politicians, generals, diplomats. Who did you meet? And Could you share with us your conversation?
So I had a chance to talk to lots of very interesting people from NATO, from different European governments, from think tanks around the world. And I enjoyed sitting down for a beer with Todor Tagarev. He's a member, like Serhiy Leschenko, of the European Leadership Network where I work. And he has twice been Bulgaria's Minister of Defence. He spends most of his time as an academic, specialising in defence with a particular interest in defence technologies. But he had spoken the year before at the conference while he was Defence Minister, talking very calmly about how obviously Europe does need to invest more in defence in the future because we don't get to enjoy the peace dividend that we had after the Second World War, and bearing in mind US retrenchment. So I thought it would be great to sit down with him and quiz him a bit about what Europeans should be doing at the moment.
It has been clear for a fairly long time that Europe does less than it could do and should do in the field of defense, and continued to rely for so many decades already on the United States for its own defense proper. It is really time to do more about defense. From what I know, already before the latest statements by the new US President and his team, the European Commission was preparing a defense white paper calling for 3% of the GDP on defense. Now I expect to see much more rigorous move towards working together for the European defense. I think that all the statements that have been made in different EU formats and individual leaders emphasize the need to work closely and to strengthen the transatlantic relationships.
Yeah.
And that is indeed very important, but also Europe needs to put more effort to be able eventually, especially given the latest statements, including here in Munich, to be able to do much more by itself. One of the issues here is who is Europe, who will be making the decisions, who will be talking to President Trump and his administration. For me, the format that took shape a couple of months ago and was earlier this week announced as Weimar Plus is a good format. That's the Weimar Triangle with France, Germany, and Poland, plus Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the European Commission, the High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas. It seems to me that's a good format, but in addition to the need to strengthen, to continue working on the preserving the transatlantic relations, on the need to support Ukraine so that it can achieve just and sustainable peace, not any peace, but just and sustainable peace, and also the statement that no negotiations about the future of Ukraine can be conducted without Ukraine and Europe.
Is there a role Europe should play with an initiative for a political settlement? I mean, it seems almost strange to see the US putting itself forward as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine without Europe, but maybe Europe needs its own initiative in some way.
I believe that Putin and his buddies in the Kremlin are very happy with the developments of this week. They were practically recognized as an equal partner, as someone with whom the United States may negotiate on an equal footing. Actually, what Trump recognized with this phone call and the statements publicly announced that Russia has certain rights to define the future of Ukraine, and the U.S. administration has already taken for granted some of the requirements Kremlin had about no NATO future for Ukraine and preserving the lands it has captured at least, which is a huge success for Putin actually already. While Putin and no one from his circle has given any indication that Russia is willing to compromise.
One last question I have is really about the resources, because here at the Munich conference, a lot of people have been talking about the percentage of GDP targets for defence spending and the need to pay more for peace. But in all our countries, there's a lot of pressure on the budgets. Healthcare, housing, social services, the bills that we still have from COVID. And how can Europeans build up public support for defence spending when people may not in every country see that as important in their daily lives?
It seems to me that the leadership understands the issue, understands the need for increasing defense budget and increasing the capacity of Europe to take care to a significant extent, possibly not fully maybe at this stage, but to a significant extent on its own. And there is the understanding that will require the increase of defense expenditures. So it depends on the perception of the political leaders, which to a large extent is there, not among all parties, but to those that are in power now in most countries, there is this understanding. And for the perception of the people, I think there needs to be a communication. It needs to be explained, because we'll quote Ursula von der Leyen, who said that the outcome of the war will define the future of Europe. And we just need to explain to the people that if we don't help Ukraine now, spending a couple of percentage points more, then afterwards we'll need to be spending a lot more to deter a resurgent Russia with its imperial ambitions. And we just need to explain that to the people. It's Ukraine is our best deterrent against eventual Russian aggression on a NATO country or another European country.
So, these were really the recurring themes. Europe needs to do more. Maybe we were slow to wake up. We need to do more independently of the US. The US is going to be unpredictable. This is going to cost money, and the maths of the money and the militaries don't necessarily match the sense of urgency that people are now communicating. And I enjoyed at the end of the conference attending a lunch with the heads of think tanks from around the world, which included a lot of people coming from outside of Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, from the Middle East, and asking them how they see this tumult and turmoil inside Europe, because of course you get these different perspectives. And one recurring theme was loads of the side events are talking about human security, women, peace and security, the global south. But the main stage basically is just talking about defence spending. How can Europeans bridge these gaps? How can they get beyond we've got to spend more money on arms response, and also link up with how do you get your societies to stay safe and resilient? Who are your other friends around the world if you're less sure about the US, and how can you try to keep their security needs in mind as well? A number of people said to me, we felt a certain schadenfreude when we heard Vance's speech, because we are so used to the Americans lecturing us. And frankly, we're pretty used to the Europeans lecturing us. And so it's kind of fun to hear that lecture being delivered to the Europeans. But we know that that's a superficial reaction, and that if everything is becoming more messy and disorderly in Europe, it won't be too good for us either. But they did say, why not talk more about how Trump has given such a tough time to his neighbours in Latin America, how he's picked on South Africa. Let's try to find common causes here. Anyway, I was very happy just after that lunch to speak to Ottilia Anna Maunganidze, who is the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa, but working on issues that span the African continent. Ottilia and I also got to take part in a great panel where we talked about the future of the rules-based international order.
When the Vice President of the US spoke, it was perhaps one of the first times that I've seen a US leader not get a standing ovation after speaking. And I think that particular input really cast quite a dark cloud over Munich. You could hear it in the tone of people's contributions, words such as urgency, such as aggressive, such as is the US still our ally, is what I heard from Europe. But then at the same time, I'm from Africa. So in this instance, Africa was not scolded. Africa was very much present in the room in different ways, whether on the main stage with the Congolese and Ghanaian president, or in a series of different side events covering pretty much all African issues and African regions. But the message still resonated because for Africa as well, we are impacted by drawdowns on development aid. We're impacted when securitization messaging is the primary message, or when the idea that migration out of Africa or other parts of the world threaten the identity of other regions. These are messages also to the continent, seeing more conversations that are not narrow in scope, that aren't just about the transatlantic partnership, even as though it's centered. That's important.
You know, and what Ottilia said there really echoes what I heard from lots of other people about Europe understandably focusing on Ukraine as a European issue, but just needing to remember that bigger systemic piece as it tries to find ways of partnering around the world.
After the break, does the Munich Security Conference actually help order the disorder? Jane, let's order the disorder. Was this a successful summit? How did you feel leaving it? Do you feel energized that Europe is kicking itself back into gear? It's going to up defense spending. And was there a way in which Europe is now finally united against the threat of Trump?
This Munich Security Conference has given Europeans a greater sense of clarity and urgency about the need to see how Europe can function and stay secure and peaceful, even if the US is extremely unpredictable and facing quite a lot of internal disruption. But that is going to take quite a long time also to play out, because the European defence and security establishments in all these countries have relied on a certain version of the US, which is now in question. So it's a really deep rethink. And I think the future is still quite unclear. So I heard so many people saying, Europeans should have been ready. Why weren't we ready? We've got to get ready now. But they spent more time saying that than what does readiness look like? We do see this emerging consensus among leaders that defence spending has to increase. And we see more countries now talking about European troops potentially being deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine, which Keir Starmer has said about British troops. That's not to go to fight Russia, but that's to go to be on the ground to help deter any future attempts to breach whatever ceasefire agreement might be agreed. I felt like the discussion needs to go a lot further beyond defence spending, because when I think about people beyond the international relations foreign policy bubble in which we spend a lot of our time, Jason, I think that people don't necessarily buy into paying more tax for defence or giving up other things for defence, because the stuff that they do care about day to day is much more linked to health, education, council services and things like that. And so there's got to be a lot of work done on societal solidarity. But that is in an era where people just don't have much trust in governments across the board. I think the conversation about European defence needs to be much broader. Obviously, there are real issues about buying weapons, making weapons, and staffing up militaries. But if you have the discussion solely in those terms, which was largely the case at Munich, you lose a lot of people who are saying, are we not investing in peace? Are we not investing in conflict prevention? Why should I be afraid of Russia? I don't think they're going to come after me. So I think we do need a more human security approach. That is not something defence ministries can do by themselves because it's not their remit, but it is something that heads of state and government need to do.
Did you hear any great proposals on what NATO should be doing or what the Europeans should be doing that our listeners can think about as ways that the disorder could be ordered?
Europeans now need to think about what the defense of Europe looks like if there is a scenario where the US withdraws. Now, we don't know if the US is actually going to withdraw troops from Europe. We don't know how serious a lot of the current rhetoric is. But it's become clearer that it is a real possibility. A little while ago, I spoke to someone who was a diplomat in DC for a European country when Trump was elected first time round, and they said they'd had a discussion internally about whether they should do some analysis about what their security would look like if the US wasn't supporting them anymore and if the US pulled out of NATO. And they were told, well, we can't possibly do that analysis. That won't happen. You know, governments have a difficulty about thinking about things that are very, very radically different sometimes, especially when they're politically unpalatable. So even if it's not going to happen, even if people don't want to think it's going to happen, what would NATO look like without the US? Is there a NATO? If there's not a NATO, what is there? All of these things need to be contemplated now, and the maths needs to be done.
Any final takeaways, Jane?
I think the final thing to say is that a lot of the discussion was about the rules-based international order, as it's called, but also people who were politicians realizing that much as we love talking about order and disorder on our podcast, the rules-based international order actually means nothing to most people. It's an extremely vague phrase. And as people make the case in the coming months and years for sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, what is it that you say that they are fighting for? Defending borders and defending a system where people don't just change borders when they want to on a whim. Defending a system that is something better than might is right. These are important things. But they do need to be put in these terms that are a bit less abstract, because couching these things in terms of, transatlantic relations and international order, it becomes quite unclear what they actually mean for normal people day to day. Well, that's it for this week's deep dive into the backroom chats of the Munich Security Conference. Tap follow so you can get every episode as soon as it's out, and so that you can hear more as soon as all these sorts of issues we're discussing play out. There's going to be a lot more to come in the next few weeks, I am sure.
Yep, if you want to learn more about anything we've discussed, please subscribe to the Substack. It's free. The link is in the show notes. Our producer is, as always, the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thank you very much for listening, and hope you have an orderly week.